All right, everybody. We're here with our Merging Minds podcast, and our guest today is Dan Blank. Dan is the founder of WeGrowMedia, where he helps writers develop a human-centered approach to marketing and reaching their audience. Dan is also the author of the book Be the Gateway, a practical guide to sharing your creative work and engaging an audience. Dan has worked with thousands of writers and amazing organizations who support creative people such as Penguin Random House, Sesame Workshop, Hatchet Book Group, Workman Publishing, J. Walter Thompson, Abrams Book, Writer House, The Kenyon Review, Writer's Digest, Library Journal, and many others. Dan, thank you so much for being here. I know you have a very rich personal story and journey of entrepreneurship, poetry, and would love to hear it from you. How have you gotten where you are? And tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's a big question. It always feels like I recently wrote a reintroduction post on my newsletter. And it's funny because I think that when you move ahead with things, it never seems to make sense. You start finding the threads of what matters to you. So for me, I've always been an artist and a creator and a writer. And that has been the common thread through my work. So the work I do now is I help writers share what they create, help them build their platforms, launch their books, all that sort of thing. And that's been the main thread, is thinking about how we create and how we write, how we get that in front of people, how we create meaning in that process. How I got here feels like too big of a question in terms of like how to start narrowing into a way that you would find useful for your audience would be helpful for me.
Sure, but and we'll get to the narrowing down part. But I'm primarily interested in knowing from you, when did you discover you were a writer? How did you discover this? And what was this process of realizing that this was your path?
Yeah, I mean, the writing always felt like it was in service of the creative idea. So I grew up like at age 5 and above, going to art school and painting and projects and paper mache and building things and flat art and all of that. And the writing always came in when a project required it. So if I was doing something and there needed to be a theme or needed to be a storyline, my early efforts to try to write like a novel in 7th grade were, pathetic and horrible. But it really came in a little bit, in that era when I had to write something. I wanted to do a class for creative writing. I was in a creative writing class in high school. I wanted to do this book with photos, and like I had to write because the project required it. And what I think I found over time is that it's difficult to express ideas sometimes visually. And for me, I found that writing felt like it was that cleaner path. So what went from the beginning as something I did in service of the art project kind of flipped, where the art became in service of the writing. And I think too, I came to embrace the idea of nonfiction and memoir. This idea of writing about what you experience and what you know really took hold with me. And I was relatively early to blogging and newsletters and social media, which is inherently about sharing your experience. And to me, that helped really fuel it as well. I've had a weekly email newsletter for 18 years. So every week it's writing an essay and publishing it, writing an essay and publishing it. And that repetition, I think, not just the repetition of writing, but having to publish it really changed something in me. Because to me, sharing something that you create is inherently a risk. Feels terrifying, it feels exciting. And I think that having that practice, whether it's online or through books or something else, it's a beautiful thing. So that is part of at least my journey of embracing myself as a writer.
So if I understood I'll echo back what struck me about what you said. But I think what really struck me is this idea that you were always, not always, but I guess from a very early age, in touch with your own creativity and expression. And you were first using the art, like visual art, as a medium to express that. And I guess your perspective on writing seems to me like the idea of words is it's a medium through which creative expression takes place, and that medium resonates more with you. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think during those early years, maybe for any artist, is you're figuring out your medium. You can work in plaster, you can work in watercolor, and
Right.
at the time you don't know. It all feels like it could be your thing. I'm gonna be a filmmaker. That I figured it out. And then you try filmmaking, you're like, I am not a filmmaker, but I'm a sculptor, that sort of thing. So yeah, that was the process that worked out for me of discovering that.
Interesting. And in your opinion, would you say, and you mentioned nonfiction, for instance, in your opinion, is there a difference in fundamental difference in creativity with fiction and nonfiction, or would you say any kind of writing is creative if you make it so?
I would definitely agree that any kind of writing is creative if you make it so. And this is, I mean, I've worked with thousands of writers, and to me, it is that ethos. It's what they bring to it. I have worked with people who are, doctors and lawyers, and you can have writing that is it's just writing. It's getting the job done. It's a contract, and people who bring more to it. I will say that, people who write novels and make up these worlds, I think that is an incredible craft, because I don't have that capability, to do that. So I do look at that as very unique in some ways, but I absolutely feel that anyone who writes is creative and is pulling from that creative well, and it comes from the ethos that they come to it with.
And in your opinion, in this idea of expression, what are some of the benefits that you feel from your writing process? What does that create?
Yes.
Self-reflection, learning, like what do you feel?
Yeah, some of it is craft, the idea of showing up to get better at something. And I think writing or any kind of creative expression, inherently, I like to view as a craft that you are learning this better and better. And that's why in my life, I primarily work with writers, but I study filmmakers and painters and anyone who has a craft around what they create, because you realize that no matter how good you are, there are layers of improving, of getting some angle of that better. Self-expression is definitely a big one, because it's a matter of understanding what you want to say and how you're capable of doing that. It's also, I think, of figuring out what makes you feel unique in the world. Like when we start writing, it's like when you're younger, like in high school, you can look back on it, but there's often these quote unquote rookie mistakes that people, where they write a love poem and they think it's the deepest, most whatever thing ever. And sometimes it is. There are many people who their earliest poems are just legendary. But for a lot of us, it's sort of like, it's the same tropes again and again. But through that craft, you learn, how can I express myself in a way that feels unique? What is it unique about what I can do and the way that I view things? That's something I've looked at, where I'm able to look at my own work now and feel, well, this is what's kind of unique about it. This is why people would follow my writing. It's not totally unique in the universe, but there's a worldview, there's an angle, there's examples I use, and most other people aren't going to pick those examples. They're not going to structure it in that way. And that's definitely a form of creative expression. There's definitely a form of pride with that as well, of understanding, like, I have something, a way of doing it that's a little unique. It could be weird, but if some people like that weird, unique thing, then that feels like you've finally kind of found a thing that's yours. And I do think that for a lot of people who create, that's a part of it, is understanding not your identity through it, but this thing that you create, of knowing why it's special and feeling that you're doing something that only you can do.
That's very interesting you touch on that, because now connecting it a little bit, I think that creates a very interesting segue to part of the drama in our field. So we're in the translation field, and translation is a subset of writing for sure. It
Sure.
does involve interpretation and rewriting, but it is a subset of writing. And I think one of the main things that is in check these days is through generative AI, there's this authorship, especially in translation. I mean, even if you use generative AI in writing, similar things happen. But in translation, because you're already working with a more restricted scope of expression, it's really easy for people to feel like if they're using that, they're not being unique anymore. And just to specify a little bit further, if you have a sentence that's saying the same thing as something in English, but now in German or in Spanish and another language, and you don't have that much room to change, and your role is to review and accept something, that level of uniqueness really becomes challenged. And I guess just connecting to what you were saying, what do you think makes something unique? Is it more of a matter of form, or is it more of a matter of actual content, or is it both that makes someone feel that level of pride and satisfaction over writing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I imagine, I don't know for certain, but for some translation, it is purely about accuracy, and there are measures for how to ensure accuracy. But for other things, I think what I always consider is context, and I consider the danger of sameness, the idea of that AI or Google Translate or whatever can do this thing that is very stuck, and then they start pulling from the same model. And then we might not even be aware of it. It's just this same translation. And again, you're the expert with that is producing the same result. And I see this already happening with a lot of the early AI that I've been playing with, whether it's writing. And if you ask for headlines, I know what it's going to give me right away in terms of the structure. It's going to give me 9 words with a colon after the first 2 or 3 words.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I'm doing a visual, Mid-Journey or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and I ask for something, I already know it's going to give me basically this animation style or that animation style.
Mm-hmm.
You already know what it will give you as that first pass. So I think that context really matters, and what the artist, what the writer, what the translator brings through it is such a greater depth of knowledge and decision making of if this is the ethos and what's trying to come across. From a writer, they know that in here. How do I interpret that? I imagine for a translator, it's that same thing of it's not just here's the words in the paper from the original writer, here's the context, and here's what we think they're trying to say. It takes into account so much more, and then the beauty of that role is taking that into account and saying, here's what I feel does these things together, including some decisions that might be even different than someone might expect because they're taking into the totality of the context around that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess even in writing, like you were describing, right? It's very common. If I take a look at my writing, for instance, I would say that the earlier back I go, the more stereotypical conventional tropes I would use, the more I've learned to embrace my own voice, the more I realize that perhaps the beauty of it all is figuring out what metaphors make sense to me, even if they're not the commonly used metaphors to express, let's say, what love is or what pain is, what suffering is, and so on. And like you said, I think those are super contextual decisions. To what degree do you think, in your experience with writing, how much is it a matter of bravery, would you say? Do you think that applies to writing?
Yeah, I think that's a huge component of it. Because some of it is figuring out how honest to be. And that I always think is a part of it, which is if you're telling a story, how deep do you want to go? What angles do you want to cover? And I think as well, I think about this a lot for my writing is it does feel like there's risk in a way. It's like the examples that you give are really important. And I used to have a lot of be very apprehensive, like, well, I'm taking a film analogy, but my audience is writers, and maybe I shouldn't do that. And I come to embrace, which is like, this is literally what I'm obsessed about all week. No one else is going to write it in this way, and it is a risk in a way. I know that like the more expecting is to give the same book launch advice for writers with the same dramatic headline. Like that would do better, frankly, and it would be more expensive. But it's not who I am. It's not what I'm thinking about. And I think that over time, people learn that voice and that perspective is really what they're following. Yeah, they need the topic, but it's that unique perspective is the thing that I've developed, the craft I've developed. But I think it's also what makes people care about that writing or that writer in this case. Bravery is a big part of it. It's terrifying to click publish. It's terrifying to know the right headline, the right story, what to leave out, what to leave in. And to me, that's what makes it exciting. I'll be 51 years old this year, and I feel so fortunate that because I publish and I write, I have that feeling. I remember being creative when I was young, that feeling of like, oh, I'm so excited and I'm really scared. And when I was 18 and 28 and 38 doing these projects, that's how I felt. I'm like, this could be so dumb and it really might not work, but it could work. And I think that people, the writers and creators I talk to who don't have that are like, yeah, I mean, I'm known for this thing and I've done this for 20 years, but like I stopped caring about it years ago, but it works, so I keep doing it. And they really are having a crisis and they don't know how to get out of it because they are playing it safe for a lot of logical reasons, but then they're trapped by that safety sometimes.
And one thing that I'm hearing in the subtext, but I think it's important to ask, do you think you need a reader for there to be writing, or do you think that just writing for oneself is sufficient for that writing experience that you're alluding to?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot recently. Without question, to me, just the act of writing is enough because you get so much out of it, and that expression of putting something down, working on the craft, having it there. I've created a lot of writing and art over my life that was never meant to be shared, was never shared, never will be shared, and I'm a better person for it. Though I will say I do think that something magical happens when you take the risk to publish it. You think about it in a different way, and if anyone resonates with it, it's like your worldview, your intention matching with their worldview and how they're receiving it. Something very unique is created in that, and I think it's something that's very beautiful and can change your understanding of what you created, but also their understanding what's possible. And I think that's just so cool. It's why so much of the work I do focuses on the sharing of how we write and how we create, because that's that effervescent delicate thing, of like, I have this idea for a movie or for a book, and this is what someone said to me who read that book. And it's like, that's just so neat.
I share, I would say, the same passion, not the same, but I share a profound passion for writing, and I see exactly what you described. For instance, the learning process that takes place when I transfer words from my mind onto a paper, the self-reflection, the openness of awareness and consciousness. So I see a very valuable process in it. But when I look around, I would say very few people, at least in my world, take the time to write. Why do you think that is, that writing is not really treasured as such a valuable skill or process in our current world?
That's a really good question. One, I do think consumption has been easier, and a consumption of a greater variety of things. Like, I'm on YouTube all the time, and I'm amazed at how I'm discovering these tiny creators or niche creators. And some of the stuff I follow it's so weird in a way, but it's neat. Like, follow concrete companies who say, we're going to pave this driveway today, or an electrician saying, I'm going to take apart this lamp and see how it works, or a guy who who is going to fix a guitar, or he's going to fix a shoe. I just love that I get to be inside that workshop, and that can make me feel creative in how I'm consuming, which is, of course, not true. It's just how we're experiencing these things. I think creating is hard. I think people do mix it up with the idea of the creative act with how they're identified and how they're validated. So often they think, well, I'll create if I'm going to publish, if I'll get recognition, if something good. And they really don't know how to think about it. I'm going to create because I feel like I might want to learn how to create. Like, I have a guitar here and I practice guitar every day, and there are millions and millions of guitarists, and they're all really good. I do think that a lot of times we dream of this, I'm going to perform, I'm going to be in front of, and like, for me, I'm playing guitar for myself. I just want to be able to sit on my porch with no one around and just be able to pick up this instrument and play for a while, and then put it down and go back to my life. I think too often it's either very difficult, which it is. We do these things. Someone plays, Garage Band or some video game guitar, and they pick it up and they're like, oh, this is hard. I'm not going to stick with that. Or they want validation from it. They dream of getting on stage and playing some Van Halen riff and wowing everyone. And I think that keeps them from just doing the work of trying, of saying, I'm going to write, and it might not be anything, but I'm going to see where it goes, or I'm going to see what I express, or I'm going to surprise myself at what I wrote, which I think is such a cool process. Most people in my life are creators in some way, shape, or form. That's the beauty of being an adult. I kind of self-select. So if I'm at a party or I'm somewhere and someone does anything creative, like, I'm like a beeline to that person. And I'm very polite, but like, if they're talking about their role in the pharmaceutical industry, like, I'm kind of backing away very politely. It's like, I'm so happy that you're happy, and I'm going to be over here right now. It's like, I just think there's something inherently, as the word you used, brave and interesting about people who put it out there. And I think it's a difficult thing. And you brought up AI. I think that AI is going to change how we perceive that as well. And that's another way of looking at what it means to be a creator.
Yeah, I love the phrase that you used, this idea of creative consumption, where it's like it's emulating this vicarious sense of creativity that's not really real. It's like you feel maybe creative, but you're not really going through a creative process. And I would say, I don't know if you see differences in processes, but when it comes to my own writing, one thing I discovered last year, I began writing more on, for the first time, I began writing more. I created a Substack, and I began writing on the research and development process around our technology. And I realized that in the process of putting together these technical pieces, I had to do so much research that I would have never done otherwise. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, the writing is forcing me to learn things that if I didn't have like that necessity to write, not only I wouldn't have taken the time to A, read these things, and B, I wouldn't have had this pressure to really understand them in a way so that I could re-express them in my own words. So I wanted just to ask you a little bit about how much learning do you find that takes place in the process of writing?
Oh, that's a great question. And I love that example. Some of it is you're learning a lot about what you think, because it's easy, especially in the age of social media, to have a quippy little opinion where this is what it is. When you have to put it out into the length of like a typical Substack, well, you've got to like, well, what do I believe? Or how do I okay, what do I mean by that? You've got to kind of expand upon it. And then I do think that most people, maybe not all, I know I do feel a sense of responsibility that if I'm referencing a person or some event from the past, I want to make sure I have it accurate. I want to get the quote right. I want to know what year it was. I want to know the context. So it does feel like a responsibility, partly because for me, like I don't want to get it wrong and then be called out on it. Some of it's just that fear, but it's also like, what is the story here? And sometimes I do that research and I'm like, oh, I thought the story was going to go this way and it's not supported. And I've got to let that die, which is hard because you thought there was this clever connection that you were making. To me, what I like about it, I learn a lot about what I think. I learn a lot about how do I put this argument out. I like writing to deadline, and some of what I write is very like planned ahead. Some of it's not. So my post for tomorrow, I had an outline this morning. Right now it's half done. And I'm at that point where I'm like, I'm positing this idea. I don't know if I'm supporting it yet. I know I've got these pieces, I've got a couple of notes, but like tonight and tomorrow morning mostly, I've got to really make sure this is fully supported. And I've got to think about the headline, the subhead promised this, the opening goes into that. How am I following that up? How do I wrap it up at the end? And one, how does it feel complete to me is the first thing. But then if I'm setting the expectation, am I supporting that or am I not? And I think that we see a lot of stuff online that might not do that. And that is the challenge where the research and the craft of it really encourages me to think about, well, where is my standard with that? And am I living up to that standard?
Yeah, I love that. And just connecting with that, for instance, just to give a very concrete example, I remember last year I had to write a post on privacy and generative AI. And if you asked me before I began writing, if I knew about that, I would have said, yeah, I know about that. I can talk about that. And then when I had to write about that, the first thing I had to come to terms with is I knew nothing of it. And it's like, it really like the process of writing forced me, number one, to be aware of how little I knew, because one thing is to be able to wing it on a 5-minute conversation. The other thing is to be able to actually write something meaningful and authoritative about something. So for me, I personally just love this idea of how, if I'm writing from a technical perspective, how it calls me out on my own lack of knowledge in all these little gaps in knowledge, and then those gaps then get filled by researching, learning, and it just, for me, I don't think I ever realized, like during my college years and high school years, I don't think I ever realized the value of writing essays as far as like so integral to the learning process. I kind of treated them more as like a formality, something that I had to get done, and an assignment, rather than the learning process itself. And starting off, okay, I need to write, so because I need to write, I need to learn. And like it took me longer to connect those things.
It's such a great point, because I do remember college and thinking of like, oh, I have to write a 10-page paper, a 20-page paper. And it was like the worst. And you're like, oh, they want I've got to go to the library. Now it's like, to write long is easy. It's writing shorter that's hard. And then the idea of doing research is like, it's almost like I get lost in research. I've got to cut off the research because I want to keep going deeper. And it's so funny how that younger perspective, when it was assigned, felt like such a drag, and you fought it, or I fought it. And then as an adult, I'm sort of like, oh, I get it. And I love these aspects of it. That's a really great example.
Yeah, makes me wonder, hearing you say that, if there's something that could be done better from an educational system perspective, because it's exactly how you say. I think the framing of it as an assignment with, let's say, a minimum page requirement, citation requirement, certain structure to it. I think, if, for me at least, for my kind of mind, if it were something, I don't care if it's like a page or 10 pages, I need you to write something meaningful about this topic. Maybe it's just a matter of maturity, and I wouldn't have been able to take advantage anyway.
It could be. I think some schools are helping. Like I have a 13-year-old, but last year he was in like essentially a TED Talk class, where instead of writing, they did it as a talk. You got to pick any topic, and you could tell the teacher was doing a lot to try to figure out their interests, and also making it a little more fun and performative. Because at that age, it's hard to think about writing 9 pages or 5 pages on something. I think they're trying, but yeah, it's a good point about how the system can do it better.
Yeah, but I love that word performative, because I think for me, it was either like writing some real fiction-esque kind of stuff that would feel performative, or it was always like this drier technical writing. And one thing that has really opened my mind is that even technical writing can be super performative if you allow it to be so. And then and that for me just opened up a huge universe universe of possibilities. I was like, this is fun. It's like before in my mind, it was like either writing about fun story that I had in mind or writing about some dry business case or tech or something like that. And I think it's so fascinating if I'm able to look at this ostensibly drier form of expression through this performative lens. I'm like, oh, this is something that I can have fun with. And I guess my question to you is, do you think it's realistic to have fun most of the time you write, or do you think it's not? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think of it as fun. I think of it as fulfillment.
Okay.
And partly it's like I'm from New Jersey. We're a state of very jaded people. I love working. I love being serious at times. So sometimes the goal is not fun, but I'm enjoying the process. So it's this idea of the answer is yes, with slightly different terminology. But yeah, that's what I love about our age is that we, like you talk about writing about your company and the tech and all that, where everyone is learning. I can be a storyteller. I can talk about the emotional journey of coding this or building the team or launching something. And that gives people a way in, or let me talk about how we built this or what it does and why it's interesting to me. It gives people a whole different way into that, which I think is fascinating. And it's like all those people I talked about on YouTube, it's like you would never think like, oh, do you want to watch an electrician work? You'd be like, no. And then you find one electrician who's just a little charismatic. And then they're really like, let me show you it's working here. I'm going to electrocute myself just for a minute, like, and you do this thing and they're like really good at teaching. And you're like, I love this channel. He's figured out that angle that makes it interesting. And I think with writers and with a lot of people online, like then it's not just the topic that's in your life, it's the person. It's that your perspective of how you talk about this has given people a way in and they want to they understand you and your company better, but also they understand the topic better.
Yeah.
And that I think is a real gift.
I agree. And I find myself happening the same thing. Like maybe I'll get into coffee or something that I never thought like I'd love before, just because someone is able to impart this really passionate and colorful perspective onto something that for me previously coffee was coffee. You just brew it and you drink it and that's it. And then all of a sudden it like opens up into an entire universe. And through good writing, they're able to like make me feel like a part of that universe. And it's just, I find it such a gift. But one thing I do want to point out in what you're saying that I really, I mean, I don't know if you share of this opinion, but I think online writing really made it possible for anybody to become an author, right? Anybody can publish a blog, literally anybody. Before, to get published would be something for the very few. And now it could be for the many, but still it seems like very few still take any kind of advantage of becoming a creator, even though the barriers are so low. Most people are exactly how you described, like creative consumers, but not creative producers. Why do you think that is? Do you think that is or not, and why?
No, it's a great question. Because in a way, it's like I think there's more people creating now than ever because the tools are more accessible where you can be a YouTuber with your phone. You can go on Substack and create a publication immediately. I do think that a lot of people end up copying. They see Casey Neistat or they see Marquez Brownlee or whatever on YouTube and they copy their exact way of doing a video.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they don't get rewarded right away because you're kind of copying someone who's really famous,
right,
as many other people are, and they don't stick with it and they don't find their voice in it. It's interesting because so many writers will say things like, oh, there's so much writing nowadays and I'm overwhelmed by it. There's so many people on Substack, I'm overwhelmed by it. I do love your perspective that, yeah, but most people still don't write, which is so true. Sometimes I think that's fine because it means that the people who do are willing to take that risk and they're willing to learn the skills that are in place and they're willing to go deeper with it. I mean, I talk about this a lot, right? A few weeks ago, I wrote about, there's an interview series with some directors and it was Christopher Nolan was one of them who was being interviewed. And, I like his movies, generally speaking. And it was fascinating to hear him talk about film because he has seen everything. All these silent films he's seen, all these French films he's seen. He's just picking up movies left and right and not just saying, oh, this was a good movie. He's talking about the names of the actors, about the other 10 movies the directors did, the movie that came before it that is mimicking. And you're like, whoa, like he is creating and he's going at levels deeper. I do think some of it just comes down to the work. A lot of people they mistakenly say they're not creative, which I think is wrong and a lie, but a lot of people have that lie in their hearts and that's unfortunate. And other people just don't want to do the work involved to make something because most of the early stuff we create is kind of not great and doesn't really impress people. Like, I mean, I can think back of when I was 8 and 18 and 28 and had some great idea and like people did not care. And the trick of that is I kept creating, and finally I found something that people did care, and something where I felt like, okay, when I was doing that thing at 28, it was kind of hacky. Like it was kind
Mhm,
of like
mhm.
not a rip off in a really negative way, but like it was in the same thing everyone else is doing. This is
Right.
unique. I think it's the risk. I think people don't do it because of the risk.
But it's interesting, right? I think what you're describing, at least what resonates with me, is that at some point, just from doing it enough with enough intention, there's like this gestalt shift where it ceases to be like something kind of hacky or just copied to something unique. And I make a parallel even with cooking. Like I'm not a great cook,
Mhm.
but I used to be a terrible cook. And when I look back, I'm like, I can't believe I was that bad, and I was like burning everything and not even realizing it. And like now I can whip together, pretty edible stuff for my family, and kind of makes me proud. But when I look
Yeah.
back, there were so many years of bad cooking that were required to lead me to good cooking, and I didn't give up because I wanted to eat, and I wanted to eat my own food. But it was very, judging from my results alone, I probably should have given up in maybe year 1 or 2, because it definitely wasn't something that I did particularly well. And I guess, do you see it kind of that way? Is it a matter of just like continuing to do something until you flip this switch where it becomes yours?
Yes, and I think it goes back to what you said before about education. Like I've got like a keyboard here and a drum machine, and it's funny 'cause, again, YouTube is a great example of that. Of most people get a drum machine and then they plug in the classic 808 patterns of their famous songs, and they feel like, oh, I now have this power. And then if you keep going with it, if you keep realizing what else does this drum machine do, what else did those, why did they do it that way? Suddenly you start seeing the layer. And I love your example because it's like they don't realize that they're burning it. They didn't realize they're burning the
Right.
pancakes. They thought that was fine. And it's through you learning from other people, getting other cookbooks, watching videos, and you doing enough where you're like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't burn it this time. And it sounds, I was been burning it this whole time. Or your coffee example is a really good one too, of the idea of like a lot of coffee, the beans are just too old and the water is too hot, and they seep them in the stuff too long. So it's still coffee, it's still fine. But when you get to that point where you're like, wow, this is good, or people who know wine really well and they do all the things about the notes and stuff I don't understand, like they have they have an understanding that I don't have yet, because they've drank enough wine and they've thought about it enough and they wrote down what they had and where it's from, and it's the repetition, but it's also the education. Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, I find this all super fascinating because another aspect of writing is the expansion of awareness that I think takes place. And it kind of analogous to the whole cooking thing. Like now I realize I was burning it all along and I didn't realize it. I think there's that. But then there's also this possibility of allowing my mind to go to places that I didn't even believe were possible before, and opening up to different realities. I mean, I could write, just as an example, right? I've never, let's say, I've never parachuted, but in my mind, if I'm able to write as detailed as I could about this parachuting experience, even without having done it, I'm very likely to feel, if I really get myself into the writing flow state, I'm probably going to feel like a lot of the emotions that I would feel if I were to be parachuting. So at least I see that immense power of emulation of experience in writing. And I wonder, am I crazy to see that, or do you also see it that way?
Oh, I love that. I think we more commonly experience it through film because we can be in this harrowing scene, and if it's done right, we're like, oh my gosh, like that was so real. The way she talked about that thing, or there he's going to parachute out, we feel it. I think it's brilliant, that idea that yeah, if you were able to kind of embody that, and that's the incredible thing that writers have, where to make a film you need to have all these different skill sets and assets, and really a team to do that. A writer just sits in a room by themselves and the most basic thing, and they can do the same thing. I think it was Joseph Finder, who's an author I've worked with, who's had movies made of his books and has written books where he's talked about this in depth, where, he can do all of that just by himself. And I think it is exhilarating. And I think that if you get to be a good enough writer, you're just a good writer, that yes, it translates to you. You can feel that. And then you're doing that amazing thing that the readers, and that's what I think is great too about the idea of people talking about craft. Like, how many books are these huge bestsellers? And I've heard people like, oh my gosh, the writing is horrible. And I'm like, yeah, but I've heard fans just like that love story that you think is, horrible. They feel it. They love these characters. And I think that's just so cool. And I think that's kind of what you're indicating.
Yeah, for me, for instance, it's interesting because I only realized through writing that, for instance, watching a movie scene, for instance, as well shot as it may be, and as vivid and visceral, it doesn't even come close to what I'm able to achieve through writing. Like if you give me this idea, whether it's walking through a neighborhood in Paris at 3 a.m. and smelling the croissants and whatever, if I'm able to be very detailed about that experience, I feel like the writing transports me at such a deeper level than just watching something. And again, maybe for different people it's different, but I just find it fascinating as when I look at it, how underused as a technology writing is typically. Because again, another example is like, if people ask me to write a business plan, right? Maybe the business plan, I'm just going to say, our plan is to grow X amount per quarter or whatever. I'm going to make it into the format of a business plan, but I'm not going to allow my mind, I'm not going to take the opportunity to allow my mind to really envision what it is that we're building as a company, and what does it look like? What does it feel like? How do I wake up this morning, and how do these numbers look to me? And because I don't add these like visceral dimensions to them, I get the sense that there's a lot that I actually decrease the possibility of getting there. But I don't know, maybe that's a stretch. How do you see like writing opening up these pathways in life for things to happen?
Well, inherently, it feels like it's about storytelling, because some of that's visualizing, which is I can think back to like, oh, remember that job I worked when I was 18? Like I worked at a KFC for 1 week. If I close my eyes and just visualize, I can actually recreate the whole store. I can remember things that I didn't think I was remembering. It sounds a bit like that with writing. But I think that's also become how people who embrace that become storytellers. Like I think of like, business leaders like Tony Hsieh and stuff like that, who I think was a founder of Zappos or the head of Zappos, where like they were very good at telling the story of what they're trying to create, the transformation that we want, the experience that we want. And it's not always through writing that they're doing it, but it's a similar thing where I love that idea you're saying. It's like writing is a technology that is underutilized. That's awesome. Because I don't think we think of it that way. We think of it as this old-fashioned thing that anyone can do. And now we have better technologies that do it better. And I love it. This idea, it's not only accessible, it taps into something or encourages you to tap into something that is much more nuanced. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that is an incredible power of writing.
Yeah, and another thing that you just going on what you're saying, that this was always, I guess, a prejudice of mine. But for instance, when I would treat handwriting as the purest form of writing, and then maybe the computer writing was a little bit less, and then definitely like typing on a phone for me was just like I wouldn't even consider that writing. And the other day I began I noticed that my iOS had this journal app, and I was just looking at it, and I was like, I'm not touching that. I don't like writing on the phone. But with my life, like I end up not prioritizing journaling and don't get it done. I was like, it's there. Let me see what it's like. And I realized like I got all this fulfillment out of even writing through this journal app, just because I was able to use it as this exercise of reflection and how was my day, what I'm grateful for, what I'm going to do, and stuff like that. And I guess in this context of underutilization, do you have any like more actionable tips that you think people can use to go from not writing to writing? Is there like process, a step? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, some of it is, as you're saying, of journaling. And I think the most famous example of that is from The Artist's Way, where she introduced the concept of morning pages, which is, she'll explain it better in here, but this idea of writing every morning for a page or two just to get words on the page. Constantly people talk to me about The Artist's Way and morning pages and how that really changed their relationship with the idea of writing. I'm a huge believer in publishing as well. Like I said, I think that something changes when you have to click that publish button, when you have to do it no matter what. Like there are so many weeks I've published something thinking, this is garbage. This is the worst thing I've ever written. And then I'll get feedback from people. Like I'll get feedback being like, Dan, I've gotten your newsletter every week for 10 years. This is by far the best thing you ever wrote. I'm printing it out and putting it in my refrigerator. And I'm like, I know nothing. It's like, but that's the learning process. And I think sharing it is a part of it. I used to manage a cafe bookstore, and we'd have open mic night. People get up there and read their poetry, read their prose. And it's like, what a brave thing to do that. And I think that sharing of it adds another layer to it. Third, I think would be having some kind of accountability partner, some kind of group that you belong to, a friend, whether they're reading what you're writing, where you're writing as well. There's also groups I know where you kind of co-write, where you just get online and you work on your own thing together. Making it social, I think, normalizes that process we go through as writers of the uncertainty, and this isn't worth it, and I'm stuck. You talk to other writers and they're like, there's plenty of people I know and like, oh, writer's block doesn't exist. And it's like, that can be a challenging thing for a lot of people. Are like, oh, this thing that I have doesn't exist. And you're like, well, you don't have it, and here's why. And I'm not saying it does or doesn't, But it's the idea of like, it's just a total mindset shift of like, oh, that great writer didn't know what to write today anyway, and they still wrote 5,000 words. It's like, it totally changes your perspective of the barriers. So yeah, having a deadline, publishing, getting something out every day or every week, and then something communal, I think are three good tips for that.
Those are great tips. And do you personally then do you try to write as an iterative thing? Like, do you just get things out there and you iterate again and again over the same thing, or do you focus on finding that right form of expression with every kind of sentence that you put out? How do you typically?
I'm much more of an ideas person. So for me, I don't worry about I have like an editor who looks at most of my stuff where it goes out really to catch all the glaring errors. But to me, it's about expression of ideas. That's the thing I'm most interested in. I think of the structure. How am I bringing people into this idea? Where am I taking time with a story? Where am I pulling them back? That's the thing that I feel like I'm most interested in. So for me, that's what I focus on, where I put stuff out. My whole audience is writers. I know there's typos. I know there's grammatical errors, and I've forgiven myself for that. And they're going to have to forgive me for that too, because I feel like for me to put the ideas out there is the highest goal for myself. But for me, it's a lot of idea capture. I just write down a lot of ideas and I sort them, and then they're there when I need them, when I need inspiration, or when I'm like, oh, let me pull that and that and that, and this is going to be something new. And that's really fun for me to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And again, I think maybe what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm wrong, but the more you can kind of let go of this standard that needs to be met and just focus on the expression, seems to be more conducive towards producing work and then working to get better as a process rather than to get everything right, I would say. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, totally. And I think this is one of the big lessons of a lot of things online. Like, I watch a lot of like things about musicians, and it's funny because I'll look at like, I've watched a million interviews with Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas, and he'll pull up the tracks and he'll show you every little, and it's great because it's just repetition. Like, because some of the stuff they do is so wacky in the studio. Oh, we found this random sound, we added this, we put it in here, and that's a major part of the song. And you realize, like, because they're telling you like, we didn't think this would work, or this felt so lame, and we did it and it worked. And you start realizing that that's what it is. It doesn't always feel right, or it doesn't feel like it's going to work, but like, you kind of try these things out. And I think that that is a part of the process, that experimentation, and that, again, that risk.
Yeah, there's this element of trusting the process, even when it doesn't necessarily seem to be giving you the results that you're looking for and everything else. And I think just to
Totally.
connect that, I think another thing, at least for me, that makes writing not take place often, or storytelling not take place, is that we live in a world that you have an ease, provided that you have means, you have an ease to access certain experiences that make writing unnecessary. Like, you want to have a great meal, you don't have to write about it. You can just go to the restaurant and have that meal, do the writing for you in a way. The experience, like the material experience, replacing the ideation, the visualization, the storytelling, and so on. And in some ways, I mean, at least what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that the more you can embrace a storytelling kind of perspective of life, chances are that you're going to be able to see it through a more colorful or interesting kind of lens than just going from experience to experience. And I would say, how much do you need to write, in your opinion? I don't know if it's a matter of volume or years or consistency. Like, how much work should someone expect to have to put in to get into this storytelling mindset?
I don't think that it has to be that long, because we can look at so many examples of people who at a very young age created an amazing book or album or essay or movie, and you're like, wow, they were 19 or 20 or whatever age. Or now, because of YouTube, you see it much younger. These, like, Bo Burnham was out there at some age 14 or 15 writing these songs on the internet, and you're like, wow, like, that's pretty incredible. I think it's just that mindset shift of being willing to go there and to think about what's unique about what you do, and to collaborate with people. I think that's a big part of it as well, of sharing it with people, or seeing other people doing that, or asking them about their process. Those feel like important components of it. I'm not a big believer in the 10,000 hour rule thing. Like, it's very convenient to talk about that, and it sort of makes us feel good. It's like, yeah, I worked hard too. I put in my 10,000 hours, but it's like, I don't think it has to be 10,000 hours. And I think that the Beatles would have succeeded if they'd worked for 4 hours as well, because I think it's the time and the place and who they were and what they were writing and everything. Because I don't think you have to make this a arduous thing that you've got to suffer through for years in order to get there either.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting because I think, I mean, from our conversation, then what I'm gathering is a lot of liberating thoughts, like this idea of allowing your expression to be your own expression, your way to be your way, I hear a lot of uniqueness and individuality to the process. And are there things that you think do you think this is in some way connected even to self-esteem or allowing yourself to be you? Like what's necessary for that to take place, or is that just a matter of maturity and you need to wait till you get there?
That's a great question, because that comes up a lot, the idea of confidence, because I've talked to so many writers who say, I don't have the credentials, or who am I to write about this, or other people are writing about it better, or I can't share because I grew up in a community that you didn't talk about yourself, or I grew up not in a creative community, and my family were doctors and lawyers. I think confidence is a big component of it. I think to be able to write something that feels true to you is a very brave thing. It requires confidence, even if it's in a private journal, to share it, to workshop it, to make it better, even because a lot of people, they write that first poem and they think, well, it's perfect because it came out like that. And a lot of times it's like, no, it's good. You have to work this poem for a while to get it better, because most of it is sort of like doesn't really hold together. No, I do think that confidence is a big part of it. I think the trick of it is the confidence isn't going to come from external validation. It's going to come from you feeling comfortable in your ideas, that you feeling permission to write. A lot of people, I'm so lucky. I grew up with parents who gave me permission to create, and I'm aware of that. I knew it then, I know it now, and most people, or many people, don't. So just getting that is huge, that you feel like I'm gonna write something here that no one's ever gonna see, and I'm okay to do that. Confidence is a big part of it, because I think confidence holds us back, and I think it also holds us back from writing and creating what we are capable of. So that is a big component of it, how this becomes possible.
Yeah, it's so hard, I guess, to change the direction of these cycles, right? Because the more you write, the more confident you probably become, and the more confident you become, the more you write. And the inverse is probably true. The less confident, the less you write. The less confident you become, the less you write. Any final considerations as far as things that we can do to break or invert those cycles of not allowing yourself something?
Yeah, it's find a way to talk to other people who create. It is such a life-changing thing to just talk to another, in this case, a writer, and realize, oh, they struggle with this too. Or if you don't feel permission to write, of just realizing like, oh my gosh, like these are just normal people. And I think you get to ask them questions. You get to see that kind of up and down. I've talked to many, many, many successful writers, and it's fascinating because Dani Shapiro wrote about this in her book on writing really well, where you can have success and you can feel less confident about your writing because you feel like, well, that was a fluke. I got lucky. I can't recreate that success. And I think that when you talk to people who express that, you're like, oh, okay, I'm not a writer because I feel like I'm not a writer. Like she doesn't feel like a writer, or she feels lack of confidence. Like, wait a minute, like this is all much more accessible. And also you can kind of lean on them a bit and they can help you out. I feel like just having some kind of connection, whether it's formal through like a writing workshop or informal, you email a writer and ask them a question. To me, that's very life-changing, because now it's not just you alone, it's you having a sense of connection with a community.
Yeah, I love that, how there's this paradox of writing being something very individual, but the more you can feel like a part of a community, the more you can have the courage to be that individual. It's a very interesting paradox.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
if I want to sign up to your newsletter, follow your work, be able to access some of your workshops, where should I go? What should I do?
Sure. So the website is WeGrowMedia.com. My newsletter is on Substack, danblank.substack.com. My book, Be the Gateway, is on Amazon, and you can find me on social media at Dan Blank. And that will kind of give you a way into everything I do. I do the newsletter every week, so that's a good way in.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for all your amazing thoughts, angles, considerations. I definitely learned a ton. It's an inspiration for me to continue to hang in there and do my best to write a little bit every day. And thank you so much, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you for the incredible conversation. Thank you.
All right, everybody. This was Dan Blank. Thank you. And remember, if you liked our podcast, to like and subscribe. Take care.